With the launch of the C43, Alfa Romeo has given us our first look into what a 2023 F1 car kinda looks like. In this video, we're going to go from the front to the back of the car and look at all the different aerodynamic features and how they work. For those of you that are new to my channel, I was an aerodynamicist for Mercedes for the 2018, 19 and 20 Formula 1 seasons, and I now work as an aerodynamics consultant designing aerodynamics packages for race cars in all different classes all around the world. Now, of course, this video comes with my standard disclaimer of aerodynamic flows around Formula 1 cars are incredibly complicated, and I don't have access to any of the team's wind tunnel or CFD data, and it would be impossible for me to predict every flow completely accurately by eye. However, I'm going to do the best job I can with the information that is available to me to try and explain what some of the aerodynamic effects are that are happening on the car. And this video, of course, comes with the launch disclaimer of this is a launch car, so a number of the features that you see are going to change between launch and race 1, but there's still a few features, particularly around the bodywork, that I think are probably going to stay pretty much the same aerodynamically, so we can definitely talk about a lot of that, and some of the other interesting features like the floor edge, even if they don't stay, are still quite interesting to work through. So anyway, let's get straight to it. To start off, let's look at the front wing. Now, the first thing that I've got up here is I've got the renders that they provided us. I've got a shot of last year's front wing, and then this is from their augmented reality model. Now, what you'll see is that all three of these wings are the same wing. So they've obviously just copied and pasted the old front wing across, which I'm going to assume is not the real front wing unless they've had a particularly rough time in the wind tunnel over the break. However, I never actually analyzed this front wing from last year, so I'm going to give you guys a quick rundown on it. This front wing is very heavily loaded through the center line. This main portion extends quite a lot, and we've got a full crank all the way pretty much to the center, with a mild back off around this region here, which is probably to clean up some junction losses and blend the junction smoother underneath the nose. We stay quite cranked for a while, out to about this portion over here, and then you can see that we start to form this sort of cone segment. If you have a look, we've got a cone bit of the flap up here, the cone follows down to the leading edge down here. And so I'd say that that's where the main vorticity along here is being shed. So we probably have a fairly sizable structure rotating this way along here. Now this is going to drive some downwash alongside the tire. It's going to downwash onto the standard FIA deflector that's along there. And that should hopefully help suppress some of the tire squirt that's coming out here as well. Now, all cars will inevitably have this structure to one form or another because they've got a cranked wing with a free tip over here. It's more a question of where we locate it, and also how hard this transition is from here to here will help define some of the strength of this particular structure here and where it is shed. You can also see out here further that we have this little kink up here, so there's a little kink line along there. That's probably to also shed its own discrete structure just there. You'll also note that this front wing has a cutout just here along here where the end plate pulls forward and the rearwards most element shortens down a bit. This is largely going to promote a bit of outwash along here because we've obviously got the high pressure on here. We're cutting away there. We're going to get a bit of outwash flow around there. And I mean, we've seen more extreme interpretations of this in the Mercedes forward wing cut. Now, the rules in this area do change slightly this year to stop such an extreme interpretation as the Mercedes one being used. But I'm not 100% certain that this particular Alfa interpretation would be outlawed. I think it might still be okay. The legality is quite complex in this area, so I didn't have time to fully draw out whether or not this was legal. A quick note as we move further rearwards is that the mid-strakes that are presented on the car, the floor strakes and the T-tray, I would not assume that those are necessarily the real ones because they're very, very simplified in a similar way to how last year they had this very simplified floor on their model here, but when you look at the real thing, which is over here, you can see it's a lot more complex with different length strakes, more contoured floor leading edge like this, very different bargeboard shapes. So from that perspective, I would say don't read too much into what's going on in this particular area of the car. Now moving a bit further rearwards and looking more at the mirror area, you'll see that they run a twin vane system. This is part of their, technically speaking, mirror stay. There's obviously an actual structural mirror stay around here as well. And the intent of these vane systems is very similar to last year. We're trying to get a little bit of outwash along there. So we'll outwash along there. It will downwash on top of the bodywork, so we'll get good downwash along here. And of course, the reason for breaking it up into two stays instead of one stay is that often two vortices can be cleaner than one vortex. When you discretize it and break it down into two smaller vortices, that's often cleaner. And in this case, they've been able to spread them quite a large way, probably courtesy of the larger mirror box for this year. And that's likely allowed them to cover a little bit more area with this vortex structure and get a bigger vortex structure further downstream. You also note this mirror has this real S-bend to it that kicks out. I'm going to assume that most of that is to do with maximizing the outwash from the mirror itself. Now let's progress to one of the bigger changes, and probably one of the ones that's most likely to be indicative of the real car, and that's the bodywork, because the bodywork this year for Alfa has changed significantly compared to where it was. What we have is something of a Ferrari style inlet here, combined with a rear end that's more reminiscent of a Red Bull or AlphaTauri, where we have this down washing bit here that links up to the floor, and then we have a secondary bazooka section that is then down washing up here. And this is one of those things where now that we've had a full year of designs coming out and teams have had a real chance to pick and choose what they want best from other teams, we're probably going to see more and more of these concepts on cars that are hybrids of what other cars have been running in previous years. Now, where this particular side pod and bodywork layout differentiates itself from those other ones that I mentioned is that compared to the Ferrari, we have a massive smooth undercut through here. You can see that the Ferrari comes out in boxes a bit more here. It pulls out to the legality box and sits really wide like that. On this particular car, we actually undercut very deeply through here. And this has enabled it to have a really large region where you can have a good bit of downwash coming down off there, but also a good air path coming along and around the side of the bodywork. And while this may not have the stagnation of the Ferrari side pod, which would have the ability to push out the front wake a lot with a big stagnation pressure in front of here, we're going to have that clean airflow path, and we're still going to have a lot of the benefits of this style in terms of having good pressurization of the forward floor here, so still decent downwash on the leading edge, decent amount of loss suppression on the top here, and also the ability to drive a bit of outwash along in this region as well. Further rearwards, this downwashing style here allows you to draw a lot of this clean air that would be sitting along the top of the side pod here that's moved from sort of the inside of the car along there. You can have that clean air and draw that down and direct it towards the floor edge and the beam wing, which are of course devices that will respond very well to high quality clean airflows that will help increase that performance and help improve the performance of the critical rear end portion of the floor. Finally, the bazooka exit with the extreme levels of downwash just there. This is one of those things where introducing downwash on the bodywork will locally make a little bit of lift, but because we are increasing the downwash on the rear wing will generate a lot more downforce because it's got a lot more downwash coming down on it. And the beam wing will also be powered up by all this. And this can just be quite an efficient power up of the rear end, where you end up with an overall improvement in performance by increasing the downwash earlier on. And this isn't a new thing. This has been done on a lot of F1 cars. This is just a particularly prominent rear bodywork that is very obviously downwashing and also extremely wide at the back. If you have a look at it in comparison to last year's car, you'll see just how wide it is. You can see that we're going pretty much the whole way out here with this full width downwashing section here. It's a really big exit there. And on the old car, it had almost no exit at the rear at all. It was doing all its cooling through these big old louvers here. And that raises another point, which is this new generation car that they've presented has an insane amount of cooling. If you have a look, you've got a lot of louvers here. So you've got those louvers there. You've got these louvers further up on the engine covers, and then that huge rear exit. Now, just going by eye, that rear exit alone would be big enough to cover you for pretty much all cooling configurations at standard conditions. So what I'm going to guess is that all these extra louver panels are extreme cooling condition ones. So when you've got a really hot, high altitude track or something like that, this could be an extreme cooling layout that it's running. It's probably likely that under most circumstances, these would be fitted with blanking panels, so this would all be a smooth surface along here, or they could just be completely replaced with a smooth bodywork that just goes straight through. But you'll see that even the old louver setup often ran these blanking panels like this. So yeah, I'd be very surprised if this particular cooling configuration is what the car normally finds itself running at. This here is a great comparison between the latest Alfa Romeo versus the last year's one, and then all of the other cars from last year that have similar style bodywork. And you can just see that bulge on the Ferrari where it goes out to full legality, that portion that's quite different between that and the undercut. And you also see compared to the Red Bull doesn't downwash quite as aggressively here. We downwash a bit more aggressively, which is probably a bit more in line with the Alfa Tauri. Red Bull also doesn't downwash as aggressively at the rear of the bodywork there. Compared to here, we've got that real aggressive curve down and downwash that, if anything, is maybe closest to the McLaren. But it does look to have the most aggressive downwash on the bodywork of any of the designs here. And I just thought this was a very neat way of showing it. Now, the next detail that's probably got you all wondering what's going on is this floor edge winglet, because this was certainly the thing that caught my eye the most when I saw the release of this car. Now, one of the things that's quite interesting for this year is that the legality in this particular area hasn't really changed much. They've got a planar cut that raises the very outboard edge of the floor up by 15 millimeters. And there's some changes to the kick of the diffuser, just moving the legality boxes around a bit. But this fundamental floor edge wing could have been put on a car last year, and I'll go through the rules to explain why. Keen viewers from last year may remember my little legality boxes to show you how all the legality works around the car. The important thing that you guys need to know is this particular red box here is where you can put your floor edge wing. And that's what I believe they're using to legalize this particular device. So I've kind of drawn in what their device looks like. Now, there's quite a few rules on the construction of this floor edge wing. The most noteworthy ones are about the sections and how you have to use the sections. So for example, in X, you're only allowed to have single sections. So you can see that as I go through here, this is just one section through X. I'm not allowed to have a secondary portion that goes off and extends somewhere else in X. And that rule stops you from having winglets and stuff like that would cut back on themselves. Now, there's another rule, which is you can only have a single section in Z, and you'll see that as I come down through here, you'll see that it's only ever one section in Z. As I go along here, all of this is one particular section. So you can see that you have to maintain that section in Z. If I had, again, undercut winglets or something like that, it wouldn't be legal by this rule. Now, the other rule that is quite critical to this particular component here is actually the radius rule. So you're not allowed to have any radius that is concave that is smaller than a 25 millimeter radius. So convex, you can have as small a radius as you want. You can see I've got all these little fillets here. You're technically meant to be tangent continuous, so I should have a fillet on the end. But anyway, you get the gist. But these concave radius here, but these concave radii here have to be a minimum of 25 millimeters. And what this means is that your two veins here can't be any closer at one point than 50 millimeters. If they were closer than 50 millimeters, you wouldn't be able to fit two 25 millimeter radii in. So as a result, you have to be gapping those veins by a little amount. And this gives you three effective options. You can have this particular setup where you have all these edges flat, and then you have to space 50 millimeter gaps between all of these. That doesn't make a huge amount of sense because you're going to have to shed a huge amount of plan form to pull this particular layout off. So you can see why they don't necessarily have this one. The other layout is you go and have a whole bunch that are downwashing, well, I should say nose up. And these would be backed off with respect to the flow, so they'd be a very clean solution by comparison, but you're also going to lose a lot of load. And if these are too nose up, they'll actually start to downwash the flow, and that will start to load up the inboard floor edge. The vortex system on there will load up, and that could get very lossy and cause a whole bunch of problems in your floor and diffuser. So of course, Alfa has gone for this solution here, which is upwashing, so that these will load up all these winglets here, and they'll probably take a little bit of load off the floor edge along the bottom. You then have to have this floor edge wing connect to the floor via a number of brackets. You can see I've just drawn in these 5 brackets here. You can have up to 6. And the floor edge wing itself can be between 5 and 20 millimeters from the main floor body. So you can have a nice little air gap here that allows you to bleed air through. And this seems to be more or less what Alfa has done. So looking back at the Alfa model, let's just take what we just saw and just apply it. You can see we've got that little slot in there. You can just see the carbon weave go through it. And then you can see we've got all our little cranked winglets with our fillets along there. You can see the fillet on each one of these winglets here, and you can see the little trace on the top where the fillet's been cut, and you can see now how they've legalized this particular concept. So now that we've worked out how it's done, we need to discuss why they would be doing this and why has no one done this before if it was perfectly legal already. Well, aerodynamically, you have a lot going on in this portion of the car. You've obviously got a lot of suction that's being generated under the floor by the diffuser kick there. So there's a lot of inwash that's going to start coming in here. And there's going to be a lot of circulation that's going around the edge of the floor as that suction drives that air around. Now, if you promote the circulation around there, you'll strengthen the floor edge vortices, but you run the risk of overpowering them. So it's often a little bit better to try and break it off into multiple vortex systems. Now, you can do that by sort of just splitting it across two different edges. So something that's very common on some of these cars is that they've obviously got a second floor edge, and then they've got a flap that goes up like that, so they can bleed across two edges. That was really common last year. But then also here we've got some degree of serration, so we can discretize the vortices and make them a little bit less lossy. There is a trade, however, in that obviously when we're cranking these winglets, so we're trying to push the air up with them, that cranking this up is obviously going to produce, while it will produce local suction on the winglet, it will also produce a degree of loss that comes off each winglet. So each winglet will have a degree of loss coming off the back of it. Now, these losses can go downstream and get ingested by a whole manner of things, or if there's enough suction, they can just go straight under and get ingested in that way. Now, this is a fairly high device with respect to the floor. It's lifted up a little bit, so maybe this loss is staying high and well out of the floor, and then is just, it could be hitting the tire maybe, although it does seem a little bit far inboard for that, or it could just get sucked into the diffuser further rearwards. Generally speaking, that loss would not be a positive thing from a diffuser performance perspective. The other thing you've got too is that obviously you've got this actual plate along here. So if you just put a plate there, you're obviously going to stop a lot of the outwash that is going to come out along that edge. Obviously there's the bleed slot below, so there will be some flow coming through there, but you're still going to reduce it massively versus just it being an open cut. Now again, the effect as discussed before is that will weaken the inboard vortex, and that could reduce its tendency to blow up by being weaker, but you will take a little bit of an outright performance hit. So it's all a bit of a balancing act, and it's very hard to determine exactly what they would have hit upon with this particular setup, but that's roughly the trade-offs that would have to be considered with it. The final question is, why hasn't it been done before now? Well, the obvious answer would be that the other teams just didn't find it advantageous. Now, there is, of course, that rules difference I was talking about earlier, where basically the edge of the floor here, all along this portion here, comes up about 15 millimeters at this point. If you can see here, it's actually a planar cut. There's an overlay of the new and old legality boxes, so it's actually at a little bit of an angle. So the inboard edge is a bit lower than the outboard edge. So maybe those rules for this year mean that a setup like this is actually profitable this year, whereas last year it wasn't profitable because perhaps you've got the floor edge already quite high. Having this structure up high might be quite advantageous. It's really impossible to know, but if I had to guess, I'd say it's probably the rules making it profitable this year. The other option, which is always a potential, is that this isn't the floor edge of the real thing. This is just a red herring because obviously Sauber released a car last year that had a very serrated floor edge, not dissimilar to this, but lower down. That was what they had on their launch car, and then the real thing was nothing like that. So that's always worth just having in the back of your mind. Final thing to discuss is the rear end of the car. Now the diffuser shape, I wouldn't try to read too much into it. If you have a look at it, it's very simple, de-featured shape compared to, if you have a look, this was what they launched with last year, also simple and de-featured, very similar boat region and all that. And the real car was very different to this. They had a square corner, they had a very caved in and detailed edge on the floor, they flared out at the lower edge. So I would not be reading too much into what's being delivered with this diffuser. But one thing that I do want to talk about a little bit is the beam wing. You may notice that it's got a little bit of a serrated trailing edge. It's a little bit wobbly like that. And this is the sort of thing where obviously the first thing I just want to disclaim is this could just be for looks on the model. So just consider that as potentially an option, but let's assume that it's real. And let's talk about what are some potential reasons why you would want a serrated trailing edge like this. Now, there's lots of research about serrated trailing edges, mainly in the context of aerodynamic noise. And it kind of makes sense that it's a noise efficient thing because when you look at birds like owls, which are obviously famously known for being silent, they have a very similar type of trailing edge. But on an F1 car, road noise is not really an issue. So what are some performance-based reasons as to why they would want this particular edge? Well, some of you may have seen the serrated edges that often go on lower elements. They look a little bit like that. They're usually on the first element of an element pair or like a 3 or 4 element setup. And the point of these is largely just to spin off a little vortex at each junction there, which can help promote flow attachment on subsequent elements of the multi-element system. However, obviously with this particular thing that we've got going here, we are on the rearwards element, not the first element. So it's a very different thing to what we see there. So why would you want it when it's the very last thing that's going on? Well, you may remember me last year talking a little bit about shear layers. Remember when you crank a wing, so we have a wing that we're looking from behind and we crank it and we have flow that's going in that way and out that way, and obviously we get a roll up of a vortex at the tip. But along the wing, there's a degree of shear, and we get to the trailing edge and we've got a shear layer coming off the back, which then eventually rolls up into a somewhat unstable vortex system. Anyway, on a wing, you'll have a shear layer, and this wing probably isn't any different to a normal wing in that respect. So there's probably going to be some degree of shear layer. And what can happen is that because the shear layer gets cast off the rear edge, what these points can do is they can help break up the shear layer. So basically at each serration, you'll get a casting of a small vortex off the back. I mean, I'm drawing them probably a bit more coherent than they would be in real life, but you're basically just giving it a point to cast off discrete, more defined vortices than just a regular, more unstable shear layer. The advantage of that could potentially be that the more stable wake off the wing itself might be a little bit better for expansion at the back, might be a tiny bit better for performance, whether that's drag or downforce, just by reducing the loss out the rear. It's very hard to say, and I would say that looking at the geometry change and where it is, it's likely to be extremely subtle. It may have even just been neutral and they just kept it because it confuses opponents. That does happen. So I wouldn't read too much into it, but it's certainly an interesting thing to look at, and I'm pretty sure it's got a lot of people talking. And that's the analysis of the launch spec C43. Well, that's all for this analysis video. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel for more content like this. Leave a comment below on what videos you'd like to see next from me, and hopefully, I'll see you next time.